Known for their history of high-profile incidents, many involving loss of life, often attributable even directly to vessel stability, or lack thereof, roll-on roll-off ships referred to as ro-ros make up a wide range of vessels that can load and unload their freight by rolling it directly on or off the decks. Maintaining their stability is a complex challenge even today. Here on Brick and Mortar, we've gone in-depth into case studies involving a few ro-ro variations. The El Faro wants a pure roll-on roll-off vessel, then converted to carry a combination load, with containers on the main deck maintaining the ro-ro decks below. The Ferry Seawall, full of ro-ro vehicles throughout, with passenger compartments at the very top, a combination ro-pax vessel. Interestingly, the creation of the very first roll-on roll-off design was credited to Thomas Bouch of Edinburgh, Scotland, who designed a train ferry in 1850 to cross the Firth of Forth, the same Thomas Bouch that went on to design the original disastrous Tay rail bridge. But this method of rolling vehicles on and off the deck would remain limited to single-deck, short crossing vessels, like steam ferries or barges, for decades, in the civilian world at least. Militaries did, of course, make advancements in this arena, which the private sector took cues from, but for the purposes of this video, we will be focusing on the ways this evolved in the private sector. Eventually, automobile manufacturers slowly started realizing the benefit of export, and needed to haul those brand new vehicles en masse across vast distances, which meant transiting the high seas. But first, this video was brought to you in part by so many wonderful Immortar supporters. Videos like the massive El Faro project from last year or Blackthorn project I released in October, amongst many others, take hundreds of hours in research, cross-referencing, script writing, quality control, and editing. The channel's high standards for quality aren't without challenges. These episodes are made possible largely due to so many Immortar supporters. Brick and Mortar's strong stance against sponsor spots during videos where victims are memorialized, YouTube's push for shorter and shorter content, along with its allowance for AI-generated or flat-out copy-paste content to proliferate in the recommendation system, combined with the unpredictable nature of ad revenue on the platform, make the support from so many on Patreon absolutely crucial to the future of this channel. Since that support is so vital, I've been going all out and showing my gratitude by providing useful, regularly updated benefits that patrons with active memberships can enjoy. Listenable, ad-free podcast versions of every new video will now be uploaded to the Patreon feed alongside each video's release so that you can listen on the go, with your device locked, or even listen on Spotify. This includes several episodes from the back catalog available already. The ambient tracks you hear backing my vocals in the videos, those tracks by the artist Morse I've personally remixed, the subdued versions, as I like to call them, are now being uploaded to the Patreon and Spotify as well. This is all in addition to the existing benefits like ad-free Patreon exclusive versions of every video, supporter names in the credits on screen, top-tier patrons getting their names shouted out in the end credits by me personally, and much more. Check out patreon.com/brickandmortar because your support matters. The concept of an ocean-going car carrier was pioneered in the mid-50s, but this was more experimental than en masse, and the ship types varied. The conversion of bulk cargo ships holding anywhere from hundreds to at most about 1,500 vehicles, loading and offloading with either the ship's gear or cranes at port, a lift-on lift-off system, much like today's container ships. This process was notorious for damaging those shiny new vehicles. Many parties appear to take credit for being the, quote, first to do this, but regardless, it was generally the same concept in the beginning. Bulk cargo ships were used to haul cars on their return journeys after offloading their typical shipments like coal or grains, with the holds being cleaned out and filled with one layer of vehicles each, while others were more dedicated to the task. The cars placed on makeshift vehicle racks up on the main decks, leaving these vessels with very little freeboard. The Norse variant, for example, a combination bulker car carrier that reportedly carried up to 1,500 cars at a time, was lost off the coast of New Jersey while fully loaded during a storm in 1973, worthy of a video on its own. In this same era, it was Mitsui OSK Lines, owner of the Hitachi-built Opama Maru, who laid claim to Japan's first prototype roll-on roll-off car carrier by using makeshift ramps from dock to deck. But even with this vessel's numerous innovations and capacity of 1,200 compact cars, it still doubled as a bulk cargo ship, hauling grains or similar cargo, and wasn't a truly dedicated car carrier. Demand for imported vehicles was exploding, and by the 70s these converted, combination ships just couldn't keep up. The 70s saw a worldwide push for what would become the Pure Car Carrier, or PCC. One of Japan's first was reportedly the 9-deck, 2,000-car capacity, roll-on roll-off Canada Maru, launched in 1971, and in Europe, a group of former Royal Mail ocean liners were sold off in the late 60s and converted into these quite awkward-looking pure car carriers with capacities of a reported 3,000 vehicles. This was actually the beginnings of the prolific Hogue Ugland Group's autoliners becoming pure car carriers, and believe it or not, these two pictures are what was originally the same vessel. The left is the former passenger liner Aragon, which went on to become the Hogue Traveler on the right. The Ace Age. You may have heard of the Cougar Ace, the Heroic Ace, or even the Felicity Ace. Auto Carrier Express, or ACE, was Mitsui's branding for theirs, but they're one fleet among many, another example being Mitsubishi's Emerald Ace. In the 1980s, the literal floating parking garage proliferated, anywhere from 12 to 15 decks, holding upwards of 6,000 vehicles. Like many maritime advancements of this scale, the various pure car carrier manufacturers churned out vessels that looked much the same. The design meant to maximize the space inside, and with the cargo decks being enclosed, the vehicles are kept safe from the elements. Some of the major players being Mitsui Heavy Industries of Japan, Hyundai Glovis of South Korea, Hogue Autoliners of Norway, and Mitsui OSK, also of Japan. If you ever wonder why imported vehicles can do so well, being near-peer competitors with their domestic counterparts, whether it be the US to and from Asia, Europe to and from the US, and so on, well, this versatility and newfound speed, for the time period, in the auto industry's logistics and supply chain all play a major role. Nowadays, it's just business as usual, but at the time, it was revolutionary for the industry. Plus, when a vessel reaches its destination and offloads cargo, one of the cardinal rules in logistics is to never return empty, whenever possible. You might think your country does nothing but import everyone else's goods, but if vessels like these had only one-way trips and were completely empty half the time, this would be a difficult industry to keep afloat. And on the contrary, it's actually quite competitive, and many arrivals in port are to both load and offload cargo near simultaneously, a complex process that leaves these vessels rarely empty, if ever, something that will play a crucial role later. In addition, many of the vessels aren't simply pure car carriers or PCCs. Nowadays, they're typically PCTCs, or pure car and truck carriers, as the import-export of more than simply compact cars gained popularity early on. These don't typically appear any different from the outside because, well, most of them aren't. Their innovation lies internally, in the form of movable ship's decks that the crew can raise and lower depending on customer needs. In this example, these compact cars zoom past farm implements to then drive onto the ship Hogue Transporter, and as you could see, many of these giant farm vehicles were also being transported on the same vessel at the same time. Even in this clip, all or most of this cargo is brand new. And as an aside, something I can't help but mention from working in a certain industry for years prior to doing all this talking for a living. Yes, these green tractors are American-made John Deere brand farm implements being exported, and yes, they're incredibly popular outside the US. The foreign markets are a massive portion of John Deere's operations nowadays, and in my opinion, for good reason. But it's perhaps a lesser-known fact about American manufacturing and agricultural industries. Coming from the world of logistics, supply chain, and heavy industries, it's something I find interesting personally, and as someone originally from the American Midwest, I find it at times more than a little ironic. But I'm getting off topic here and don't want to go on a long rant. Anyhow, the history of roll-on, roll-off vessel incidents, even in modern times, has earned them the nickname roll-on, roll-over. Much like the large majority of incidents we cover on Brick and Mortar, though, they've stemmed from human error, not simply the nature of the vessels themselves. Any vessel you see on the water has its own stability limits, and familiarity, along with a certain level of serious consideration, are required to operate it safely. However, the trap we see all too often that created those incidents that stick out in our minds, Alfaro, Seawall, even Herald of Free Enterprise, amongst so many others, regarding the Ro-Ro cargo, or operations around it at least, it's been complacency and a lack of that aforementioned serious consideration. Many Ro-Ros rely either on straps or chains ratcheted down or lashed directly to anchor positions on deck via each vehicle's tires or tow hooks. On a vessel like the Golden Ray, these appeared to be 2 straps per vehicle, 1 front and 1 rear, anchoring at 4 points total, which the crew did appear to be handling responsibly, along with the ship being equipped properly to do so. But on Alfaro, for example, they were lashed down haphazardly. The deck had far too few anchors, and long lengths of chain were ran between them. Then the cars were lashed to those relatively loose lengths of chain. On ferries and relatively short crossings, it's also common to not lash down vehicles at all. I've been a passenger on many Ro-Ro ferries in various parts of the world where this is the case. These tend to have a single roll-on, roll-off deck. Oftentimes they're used for a simple crossing going back and forth several times a day, where deadlines are key. Much of the time, this is in calm waters and turns out just fine. I just refuse to wait in a vehicle no matter the size of the ferry. No way. You'll find me up on deck, making sure me and the kiddos aware of emergency egress maps, locations, and so on. But good vehicle lashing practices are just the start in roll-on, roll-off stability calculations and considerations, especially in a vessel hauling thousands of them, upwards of 70 feet above the waterline. The Golden Ray. Built in 2017 by Hyundai Mipo Dockyard in Ulsan, South Korea, the Golden Ray was one of 2 sisters built at that time, the other being the Silver Ray. Flagged under the Republic of Marshall Islands, owned by GLNV-24 Shipping Incorporated of Seoul, operated or crewed by G Marine Service Company of Busan, and chartered by yet another separate company. The ships were 2 of G Marine's 51-vessel fleet as of 2019. The Golden Ray was chartered by Hyundai Glovis Company, a sizable player in the pure car carrier market. But this charterer wasn't the vessel's owner or operator in this instance. It's basically the freight broker, like a travel agent for their many clients' cargo, Glovis being a combination of global and vision. And the ship's crew used contractor Norton Lilly to develop preliminary load plans, or what's known as the preload plan, which included allocating and calculating space on deck to accommodate the projected cargo. See, in the world of logistics, especially in ships of this type, and regardless of country or region, it's fairly common for vessels to be owned, operated, and chartered, all by multiple different companies. The proverbial onion in its layers of ownership, operation, various responsibilities, and to some extent, accountability, something we will touch on later. The Golden Ray, a pure car and truck carrier, with a length of 656 feet, a width or beam of 116 feet, a draft depth of about 35 feet, and 15 decks total, 12 of which dedicated to vehicle cargo, capable of carrying up to 7,742 cars, if carrying cars only, at a speed of up to roughly 20 knots. The Golden Ray was equipped with 2 ramps, a starboard ramp and a stern ramp. In most ports, the offset stern ramp is most commonly utilized, with both ramps leading into the main freeboard deck, Deck 5. According to the U.S. Coast Guard and NTSB, with a load of mostly SUVs, by mid-August 2019, at this point in the ship's journey, the Golden Ray would bring cargo aboard at the ports of Veracruz, then Altamira, Mexico, arriving at Freeport, Texas by August 27th to both offload a portion of their cargo and load new cargo. Now, in the industry, the terms POL, or Port of Loading, and POD, Port of Discharge, are exactly as they sound. They load up customer freight at the POL and deliver it at the POD. As I mentioned before though, in vessels like the Golden Ray, they don't simply load it to max capacity, sail across the ocean to unload, and then return empty. It's actually much more complex, and they're rarely sailing completely empty, if at all. Many stops will be both POL and POD, combined with the fact that the vessel is loaded with multiple batches of cargo from and for multiple different clients. They're kind of like the LTL, or less than truckload carriers of the maritime world, which is a very in the weeds of logistics reference. And this is where just one of many complexities begin when managing modern car carrier loads. The load shift while docked in vessels of this type is frequent, due to various cargoes being repositioned every time the ship puts in, and not just frequent repositioning on the decks, but overall tonnage being changed substantially, requiring near constant stability recalculation. It's part of why separate companies exist, to contract out solely for the purpose of calculating the allotted deck space, those preload plans. It can get very complex very quick, and the ship, like most, is on a tight schedule. To put into perspective just how high the loaded decks can get on these vessels, United States aircraft carrier decks average a height of around 60 feet above the waterline for the Nimitz class in this example, which has a draft of about 37 feet, so not accounting for the island or tower atop the deck, but where the actual shifting cargo and its impact on stability is taking place. This happens all within this roughly 100-foot tall combined hull and superstructure, with an average hull width, or beam, of 134 feet, the portion of the ship that's in the water. Compare this to the average 15-deck car carrier's overall height of about 120 feet, 31 feet of that being draft in this instance, and 12 to 13 decks being used for cargo, putting the loads at about 70 to 80 feet above the waterline, with a beam of only 116 feet. And like we covered, it isn't just occasionally or on a one-way trip that these vessels are carrying such loads. They specialize in hasty, frequent turnarounds, which means tons of cargo moving in and out at every stop and leaving port well laden regularly. With a complement of 23 crew members, on Wednesday, August 28, 2019, while still in port at Freeport, Texas, the Golden Ray carried out their planned changeover to a different master. In the relief process, both masters discussed the vessel's condition, cargo, and various personnel topics. The relief master also stated the departing master did not report any issues with the vessel or crew during the relief process. According to the NTSB, the ship's relief master, Captain Lee, seafaring since 1980, became a captain in 1995 and had been working on vehicle carriers since 2016. He began working for G-Marine in 2017. Chief Officer Park, in this instance interchangeable with First Officer or second in command to the captain, had roughly 13 years seafaring experience, 10 of which in the role of Chief Officer, with 6 of those on a vehicle carrier. On August 30th, the Golden Ray got underway from Freeport bound for the Ro-Ro terminal at the Port of Brunswick, Georgia. Around this same time, though, Hurricane Dorian was moving up the east coast of Florida. The charterer, Hyundai Glovis, and the Golden Ray's master communicated about this, and it was decided the car carrier would wait out the storm off the coast of Key West. In further preparations for rough waters, the top-heavy vessel would need to increase its ballast. From the U.S. Coast Guard, ballast water is any water taken on board a vessel to control or maintain trim, draft, stability, or stresses of the vessel, regardless of how it's carried. And from the NTSB, to enhance the stability of the vessel in anticipation of encountering the storm, the master had the chief officer load additional ballast. He did not specify how much additional ballast to load. The chief officer oversaw the loading of about 1,500 metric tons of seawater ballast into the vessel's 3 double-bottom tanks. The Golden Ray would then spend September 1st through the 3rd holding station just off the coast of Key West. On the 3rd, Glovis changed the vessel's itinerary to stop next at the port of Jacksonville, Florida, rather than Brunswick, Georgia. The chief officer was also informed that Jacksonville had a draft restriction of 31 feet. The car carrier was drafting lower than this, and the chief officer discharged about 1,500 metric tons of seawater ballast from those same tanks filled in preparation for the hurricane back on August 30th. The Golden Ray spent the next few days at Jacksonville loading and offloading cargo, as this was yet another POL and POD stop. The vessel would depart Jacksonville on September 7th at 5:10 a.m., underway for Brunswick with 4,067 vehicles, or 8,407 metric tons of cargo, the ship drafting at 30.9 feet deep. With a short, uneventful, roughly 70-mile journey to the Port of Brunswick, the Golden Ray would arrive just offshore in the afternoon that same day. A state pilot from the Brunswick Bar Pilots Association would board the vessel and take the con to bring them in to Colonel's Island Terminal, the dedicated ro-ro port at Brunswick. The Brunswick Channel was an average 400 to 500 feet wide and 36 to 38 feet deep, depending on the tide. Docking took place after an uneventful transit into port about 5:36 p.m., Saturday, September 7th, and cargo operations began soon after, with stevedores and deckhands getting to work via the stern ramp, offloading a combination of 265 Kia and Hyundai compact cars, then loading a planned 362 Kia Telluride SUVs. And if you're interested in these kind of details like I always am, a stevedore is a person employed or a contractor engaged at a dock to load and unload cargo from ships, while a deckhand is a member of a ship's crew whose duties include maintenance of hull, decks, and superstructure, and mooring and cargo handling. When a ship's conducting cargo operations in a port like this, both will often be found working alongside one another. Personally, I love details like these in the maritime world, but then again, I am a bit biased. Anyway, as the stevedores and deckhands worked to load and offload, it was the chief officer's responsibility to work with the loading plan clerk, the stevedore superintendent, and the Golden Ray's other deck officers. The chief officer would oversee this process, which meant accounting for inventory as the cargo loads and offloads, verifying vehicle lashings, and double-checking the storage plan in accordance with the company's SMS, or Safety Management System, as every group of vehicles gets assigned locations on deck based on stability and distribution of weights. It was also the chief officer's responsibility to calculate the cargo's weight. Prior to loading, it was the stevedore's responsibility to check all vehicles for, quote, faults, including open doors or windows, leaking fluids, disengaged handbrakes, and to ensure each vehicle's fuel tank was no more than 25% full. 3 of the Kia SUVs were found to be outside of compliance, so a total of 359 out of 362 ended up on board. After accounting for all of the totals loaded and offloaded, the chief officer then plugged the numbers into the ship's stability calculation program known as LoadCom, while referring to the Golden Ray's TNS, or Trim and Stability Booklet. This reference manual provides hydrostatic tables and trim and stability characteristics to help the user calculate the metacentric height, or GM, for various loading conditions to ensure adequate stability before departure and during a voyage. GM being something you should specifically keep in mind for the remainder of this story. From the NTSB, metacentric height, or GM, refers to the distance from the ship's center of gravity to its metacenter and measures the vessel's ability to right itself when experiencing an overturning moment. And yeah, I apologize, this stuff's really in the weeds, but we have to get familiar with it to understand what happened. Continued from the NTSB, a ship's metacenter, M, is the virtual intersection of 2 successive lines of action of the force of buoyancy when the ship heels through a very small angle. The initial position of the metacenter is used as a reference in stability calculations. The distance from a ship's center of gravity, G, to its metacenter is known as the GM. And I personally tend to remember GM by thinking of gravity to metacenter, once I get into maritime mode anyway, and stop thinking of General Motors whenever I hear GM. But I'm just a layman anyway, so that's how I do it. After the chief officer had calculated the vessel's stability, he reported the final GM to the master. While the company's safety management system indicated that the master held final responsibility for the vessel, he did not verify the chief officer's calculations on the accident voyage or the previous 2 voyages, nor did he compare the chief officer's calculated GM to similar loading conditions in the Trim and Stability Booklet. The safety management system did not require the master, another crew member, or any other company personnel to verify the metacentric height as calculated by the chief officer. Instead, the SMS only required the stability to be in OK condition as calculated by the LoadCom computer, all topics that will play a crucial role soon. Prior to getting underway, the chief officer acted on these calculations by only transferring 8 metric tons of ballast water from the port side number 5 double bottom tank over to its counterpart on the starboard side. No further ballast was discharged or taken on board. At about 12:30 a.m., Sunday, September 8, 2019, or that same night the vessel underwent cargo operations, the same state-certified pilot who brought the vessel into the Port of Brunswick came on board to pilot the vessel back out. After a brief exchange with Captain Lee, where they discussed the vessel's draft depth, amongst other technicalities, the pilot ordered mooring lines in and instructed the helm to maneuver away from the terminal's pier by roughly 12:53 a.m. The massive car carrier received initial undocking assistance from tugboat Dorothy Morin, the tugboat assisting by pulling the starboard quarter away from the dock and into the harbor. The weather was partly cloudy, visibility was up to 10 miles, and there was just a light breeze. The sea state was calm. Transit time from Colonel's Island Terminal to the harbor's exit would be roughly 45 minutes to an hour. The pilot was equipped with what's commonly known as a portable pilot unit. From the NTSB, the portable pilot unit provided him with a navigation chart and an automatic identification system interface that displayed the headings, speeds, and rates of turn of the Golden Ray and other nearby vessels, as well as tidal and water depth information. Once in the harbor, Tug Dorothy Morin pulled in lines and would provide escort, remaining with the Golden Ray for support as needed. By 1:02 a.m., the pilot ordered full ahead on a course of 113 degrees. While this was happening, car carrier Emerald Ace was soon to be entering the harbor, conned by a fellow Port of Brunswick pilot. These two pilots were in close communication with one another via their radios and made an arrangement to meet for their inbound-outbound encounter at the Plantation Creek Range of St. Simon's Sound. This was common practice for these encounters on this waterway, as it was the widest portion of the channel, deep enough for their draft. That particular portion was actually 1,000 feet wide, compared to the harbor's channel width of an average 400 to 500 feet. According to the NTSB, this part of the waterway provided pilots with more area for the vessels to safely meet and, if something went wrong, to prevent a safe passage, such as a propulsion failure, there was space to anchor a vessel. By 1:08 a.m., the Golden Ray passed under the Sydney Lanier Bridge at a speed of 11.5 knots, and Tug Dorothy Morin halted to await and escort Emerald Ace on their inbound transit to Colonel's Island Terminal. About the same time, the master ordered the crew to open the portside pilot door located on Deck 5, the freeboard deck, in preparation for the pilot's planned departure just outside of the Port of Brunswick. The pilot door was a watertight hatch in the side shell that opened and closed locally by an electronic hydraulic system. The door was 7 feet high and 7 feet wide. After supervising the opening of the pilot door, the chief officer went to his stateroom. The crew members left to conduct other duties, and no one remained at the open door as the vessel proceeded outbound. At 1:22 a.m., as the Golden Ray approached the Cedar Hammock Cut at a speed of 11.6 knots, the pilot ordered 20 degrees of port rudder to make the left turn of 38 degrees total, and put them on a course of 75 degrees toward the next cut, Jekyll Island Range. At 1:28 a.m., now at a speed of 12.1 knots, it was the same routine, another change in course of 38 degrees to turn into the Jekyll Island Cut. Both of these turns to port were uneventful, and the Golden Ray continued at 12.4 knots toward Widener 11, where their final turn would take them through the St. Simon's Sound toward the open Atlantic. From the NTSB, at 1:34 a.m., at a speed of 12.4 knots and a heading of 39 degrees, the Golden Ray approached the 68-degree right turn at Widener 11. The pilot ordered a heading of 44 degrees. About 1 minute later, the pilot ordered starboard 10, meaning rudder 10 degrees to starboard to initiate the turn. With the vessel's speed at 12.9 knots, the helmsman informed the pilot that the rudder was at starboard 10. Shortly after, the pilot ordered starboard 20 to enter the Plantation Creek Range, which had a course of 105 degrees and led to the Atlantic Ocean. The helmsman moved the rudder to comply with the pilot's command, the vessel's speed, now 13.3 knots. Seconds later, the pilot ordered the rudder returned to midships, or zero rudder angle. The helmsman complied, but, according to the pilot, the ship just took off. The vessel started heeling to port. The pilot stated that as the vessel began to turn, It, quote, felt directionally unstable, meaning when I started to turn, she wanted to keep turning. Crew members on the bridge could be heard on the VDR, or voyage data recorder, expressing surprise, and the pilot asked, "What's the GM on this thing?" asking the bridge crew about the metacentric height. The pilot issued a Port 10 order to counter the heel and the increasingly sharp turn to starboard. The pilot and master began swiftly issuing additional rudder commands to the helmsman to attempt to counter the heeling. However, the Golden Ray continued to rapidly heel to port, and its rate of turn to starboard increased. Additionally, equipment began shifting on the bridge and numerous alarms began to sound. Between 1:38 and 1:39 a.m., the pilot issued orders to turn on the vessel's bow thruster and put the engine in reverse in an attempt to stop the vessel from heeling over. The vessel's heading at the time was 135 degrees, and its speed was 5.3 knots. At 1:40, the Golden Ray stopped and grounded outside of the channel, southeast of buoy 19, with a 60-degree list to port. The main propulsion system and electrical generating systems shut down prior to the vessel grounding. The emergency diesel generator initially started, following the loss of power, but shut down within a few minutes, leaving the vessel with no electrical power or lighting as the pilot and crew evaluated the situation and began to respond. The portside pilot door remained open, and flooding began through the door into Deck 5. The pilot, using his handheld radio, immediately informed the other pilot on board Emerald Ace of what had happened, and then called tugboat Dorothy Morin, requesting assistance from them and any other tugs from their fleet. He then called U.S. Coast Guard Sector Charleston. The Emerald Ace pilot immediately called 911 to report the incident as well. Tugs Dorothy Morin and Ann Morin, along with pilot boats from the port, arrived quickly. The tugs jumping into action by pushing the Golden Ray toward the closest shallows, away from deeper water in an attempt to stabilize it and prevent it sinking further. About 10 minutes after the call to Station Charleston, Coast Guard Station Brunswick nearby got a 45-foot response boat underway along with an MH-65 Dolphin helicopter. The fast response boat, CG-45741, arrived on scene by about 2:05 a.m., along with first responders from the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, Glynn County Rescue, and even Sea Tow. On board the vessel, the pilot confirmed via his radio to the Coast Guard that there were 24 souls aboard, including himself. With the vessel's worsening list now at 70 degrees, no power, no emergency lighting, and the deck nearly vertical, this created a very precarious situation for everyone inside. The initial Coast Guard vessel was up against the Golden Ray, prepared to bring victims on board, but the angle was such that simply leaving the bridge was a danger in itself. The Coast Guard below, coordinating with the pilot via his handheld, instructed him to lower one of the vessel's onboard fire hoses through the bridge and down the port bridge wing. The fire hose was actually secure enough that, at 2:56 a.m., the first crew member to try this method of lowering themselves was successful, and it was repeated one by one until 11 crew members total made it safely down, including the pilot and ship's master, who both informed the Coast Guard that they were aware of 4 engineering personnel still inside, 3 engineers and an engineering apprentice, potentially trapped deep within the vessel, mentioning them specifically because, to their knowledge, the remaining 4 crew members were in the Golden Ray's engineering compartments, last they'd heard, at the time of rollover. CG-45741 started first aid for those who required it, and soon after, another fast response boat from Station Brunswick, CG-29139, arrived and helped to bring crew members to emergency services waiting on shore. Meanwhile, 5 more crew members were rescued by other first responder vessels, and the Coast Guard's helo hoisted 2 crew members to safety from the vessel's starboard side.
Hey, bring a solar survivor inside the cabin. Roger. How's that power one? Hey, solar survivor inside the cabin. We're about 87% hold. Sweet.
By 3 a.m., with the 18 survivors accounted for, this left 6 more still awaiting rescue, including those 4 potentially deep in engineering. From the NTSB, about 4:30 a.m., first responders noticed smoke and flames on the starboard side of the Golden Ray in the area of the vehicle decks. The cargo hold contained combustible materials, including tires and plastic components in the vehicles. Because of the reported thick black smoke and heat, responders could not enter the vessel to search for the missing engineers. With the fires billowing smoke out any paths it could find through the exposed starboard side, the list slowly increasing as the vessel continued settling in the soft seafloor, and with victims still inside, the situation was growing even more deadly. Quote, at 6:45 a.m., the crew of CG-45741 rescued 2 more crew members, including the chief engineer, who was trapped in his cabin, located below the port bridge wing, now suspended horizontally over the water at 40 to 60 feet. From the Coast Guard's on-scene commander, the chief engineer was able to break a window and tie 2 extension cords together and lower them down. Then, rescuers on board the response boat tied a 60-foot line to the extension cords. The chief engineer pulled the line in and was able to make a secure way down. At this time, the nearby fire's black smoke filled the area around the response boat. With the pilot and 19 crew members safe in the hands of emergency services, it would be a race against time for those 4 out of contact and trapped deep inside the now inaccessible vessel. As the incident began, when the vessel started listing, 1 engineer and an engineering apprentice were together conducting their normal rounds of the engine room. The other 2 engineers were in the engine control room. Listing to port meant the Golden Ray was taking on water all along its port side, and engineering's primary egress points were on the port side. The elevator shaft and, more importantly, nearest stairwell had begun flooding immediately on these lower decks. By 9:30 a.m., the list increased to 90 degrees, and first responders heard loud crashing sounds from inside. As the next 2 or 3 hours passed, the water had also started entering the control room. One of the engine room crew members was able to exit the control room and join the others in the engine room. But water soon covered the door and blocked the one escape route on their side of the engine room. With no illumination of any kind, the windowless labyrinth would be difficult to navigate, especially as the list neared 90 degrees, the floor and ceiling now vertical. The apprentice was carrying a flashlight, but all of the reachable exits from the engineering section were blocked by floodwater. The water was also encroaching on the engine and other major components, contaminating it with oil and forcing the engineers to start climbing up toward the starboard side of the engine room. It wasn't long after, though, the temperature in engineering began to rise. The atmosphere in the isolated, nearly sealed-off engine room went from very uncomfortable to increasingly difficult to breathe. One of the engineers stating, "We tried to climb up to the other side of the engine control room, but suddenly we felt so hot, and we hope we're grounded. If the vessel's not grounded, we're gonna die." But they also had no drinking water anywhere nearby, which was exacerbating the situation. They were forced back down into the flooded compartment to at least stay cool. Keep in mind, this was oily salt water. Outside, after the initial rescue, the Coast Guard coordinated efforts to locate the trapped crew members. Bringing local fire rescue teams onto the hull as well, they tried to open a hatch to gain entry, but, quote, determined that the risk was too great due to fire and smoke. Reports of the exact time conflict, but around either 4:30 or 6 p.m., 15 to 16 hours after the incident began, rescuers heard tapping from within the vessel that was clearly from survivors. They let the victims know help was on the way by tapping in response and staying in communication throughout the night. The following day, Monday, September 9th, there was a combined effort initiated by the U.S. Coast Guard, who then worked in a support role for the group comprised of 2 local salvage and first responder companies, another company specializing in confined space rescues, Glynn County Heavy Rescue, and the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. The rescue crews determined the only way to save those trapped inside was to cut an escape hatch into the hull, relatively near the crew members. To do this safely, though, would require cold cutting equipment. Cold cutting equipment in general enables rescuers to cut through metal without generating heat or sparks, like cold cutting saws or abrasive water jet machines. This equipment tends to be highly specialized, though, and rescuers realized it would take about 14 hours to procure it. Cutting through a ship's thick hull is much too large a cutting task for something like the jaws of life you'd see in a road-going vehicle rescue. By 1 p.m., they decided to at least drill a hole into the side so that they could make direct contact with the crew members, insert a borescope, and probe the atmospheric conditions to see what they were dealing with. Temperature readings were above 155 degrees Fahrenheit. The rescuers took action with the hole drillers they had on site and decided to forego that cold cutting equipment. They'd immediately make a series of holes to cut out a square access hatch and lift the plating away. By 3 p.m., 2 engineers and the engineer's apprentice were hauled out safely, leaving the final engineer, who'd been separated from the group. Just short of 2 hours later, at 5:51 p.m., he was brought out through the makeshift hatch as well. All 4 were in good physical condition. The rescue was complete. Less than 10 minutes later, at 6 p.m., a second large fire was reported. It's presumed, though, that the first responders had gotten clear of the site, as the fire was allowed to burn itself out. From the NTSB, as a result of the accident, 2 crew members suffered serious injuries. The third mate had a laceration on her right hand and a joint fracture of her right middle finger, and the bosun's left foot was fractured. Both crew members were medically evaluated at Coast Guard Station Brunswick and transported to a local hospital, where they were treated for their injuries. All rescue crews played a crucial role, of course, but in testimony from the Golden Race pilot, he also pointed out, "There's immense gratitude for the heroic efforts of Tug Ann Morin and her crew, who steamed at best possible speed across the Sound to assist in holding the ship on the sandbar, preventing the ship from slipping back into the depth of the channel and the crew perishing. In similar fashion, Tug Dorothy Morin did the same and assisted on the port side. They maneuvered towards survivors and ultimately put rescue teams near the trapped crew later that day." This incident played out slowly and got a lot of media attention. Typical for an event like this, there was plenty of speculation to go around. In an article dated September 9th, the day after capsizing, from the Wall Street Journal, experts they consulted speculated the cause would be down to instability of some sort. But ironically, quote, "A Hyundai Glovis executive said there was some kind of internal fire that could not be controlled and then it capsized." Yeah. One thing we haven't really discussed much in videos prior, if at all, are the effects of pollution when incidents like these occur. That said, regardless of how you feel about the environment, the amount of pollutants that are released into the ecosystem from an incident like this, and their high concentration affecting such delicate areas like fisheries, beaches, and shoals, it's staggering. And it's why you see such monumental efforts to get it under control once all victims are accounted for. In the Golden Ray incident, authorities raced to pump out and contain thousands of gallons of fuel oils, as the vessel had left port reportedly with a near full load of fuel in its tanks. Much damage was already done, though, as pollutants leached from the vessel and its cargo almost immediately. Authorities struggling to both contain it and prevent obstructions that threatened to close the Port of Brunswick entirely. The port reportedly remaining open, but with the Golden Ray wreck requiring careful maneuvering at the Sound and causing delays. The joint investigation was over a year long. For example, our primary source for this video, the NTSB's Marine Accident Report, didn't publish until August 26, 2021, just short of 2 years later. The Coast Guard's Marine Safety Center, or MSC, determined the downflooding began with that open pilot door on the port side once the list reached 17 degrees. This flooded Deck 5, exacerbating the list quickly, with investigators stating water progression likely then continued through open hatches and non-watertight doors, as well as ventilation ducts. It was found that, in addition to the portside pilot door, the watertight doors to both the aft and mid-portside Deck 5 stairwells were open at the time of the accident and had been open since 11:41 p.m. on September 7th, before the vessel departed Colonel's Island Terminal. But once that harrowing rescue was complete and the incident had reached what would typically be considered the aftermath stage, fires continued raging within. The vessel was last known to be carrying around 4,000 cars, each of those carrying about a quarter tank of fuel, and now dumped over into a tangled mess of rubber, fabrics, plastics, gasoline, and more. The once $142 million worth of cargo was now a pile of smoldering synthetic kindling, continually settling under its own weight, flaring up frequently, and making the interior completely inaccessible. The behemoth so close yet so far away, creating these sort of surreal images by authorities, reporters, and beachgoers alike. The Voyage Data Recorder, or VDR, was recovered by authorities. Fortunately, which also contained data from the IMAX system, or the Integrated Monitoring, Alarm, and Control System, that provided the ability to visualize the vessel's power management system, tank level indications, anti-heeling and loading programs, and the engine monitoring and automation features. However, the data pertaining to stability calculations and the load comp computer system was not contained on the VDR or IMAX records, and therefore investigators unfortunately had no access to it. Initially, quote, as part of its investigation of the accident, the Coast Guard's Marine Safety Center completed a forensic stability analysis of the Golden Ray using a computer model of the cargo weights contained on the final load plan and the liquid load quantities: fuel oil, lube oil, fresh water, ballast, wastewater. This was retrieved from the IMAX computer as the ship departed the Port of Brunswick on September 8th. Considering the final load plan and IMAX data, the MSC used the Golden Ray's TNS, or Trim and Stability Booklet, to find the vessel's required minimum GM and maximum kg for the corresponding drafts and trim on the accident voyage. Kg in this instance meaning vertical center of gravity. The MSC found that the vessel's minimum GM, or metacentric height, according to the TNS booklet, should have been 8.3 feet. The analysis determined that on the accident voyage, the Golden Ray had a GM of approximately 5.8 feet, below both the minimum 8.3 feet required by the TNS booklet and the 8 feet reported by the chief officer himself in his interview with authorities. The MSC also determined that the vessel's kg on the accident voyage was 58 feet, approximately 3.8% higher than the TNS booklet's required maximum kg of 57.4 feet. The Korea Maritime Safety Tribunal, or KMST, an agency that investigates maritime accidents on behalf of the South Korean government, was invited by the Coast Guard to be party to the investigation in accordance with IMO Casualty Investigation Code. The KMST also conducted a preliminary stability analysis of the Golden Ray and came to a similar conclusion to the Coast Guard's determinations. The KMST determined that the vessel's departure GM from Brunswick was approximately 5.9 feet, and the vessel had an extremely low riding energy to counter the heeling to port. Hyundai Glovis, the charterer, conducted a simulated stability analysis of the Golden Ray using the load comp computer on board the Silver Ray, a vessel of the same class. This simulation used vessel data and conditions collected by the charterer and was not observed by the Coast Guard or the NTSB. But the simulation calculated that the GM of the Golden Ray was 5.9 feet, indicated that the riding arm curve for the Golden Ray at the time of the accident was extremely low and showed a load comp status of not okay for 3 stability requirements. Additionally, the riding arm curve showed negative stability after a heel of only about 25 degrees. Or, simply put, stability calculations were incorrect to the point where, for whatever reason, adding ballast water had been necessary yet completely neglected, potentially since well before the stop in Brunswick even. And, based on statements made by the chief officer during his extensive interviews with the NTSB, yes, I do read all of this stuff, he was the only one who would interact with the load comp system. When asked by authorities, so if, say, something happened and you were ill, you were sick during cargo ops, who would do that job? The chief officer replied, maybe the captain. So the captain knows how to use the software? The chief officer followed up, I'm not sure, I never experienced this situation. And then his responses regarding knowledge of calculations pertaining to the ship's draft in fresh, brackish, or salt water appeared to provide little clarification as well. But most importantly, based on testimony from both the chief officer and captain during these exhaustive interviews, the chief officer appeared confident in his calculations which, according to him, bore out no requirement to add ballast after cargo operations in Brunswick or Jacksonville. This was then given even more validity when the captain was asked regarding the incident voyage, quote, okay, were there any ballast transfers being conducted after the vessel departed the dock? The captain responded, no. Were there plans after you departed the port for ballast to be added or removed or transferred within the vessel? To which he also replied, no. Investigators ruled out as cause weather, the transfer of ballast or fuel, shifting of cargo, obstructions in the channel, and cargo hold fires. From the NTSB's findings, The Golden Ray capsized because it did not possess enough riding energy to counter the port heeling moment created during the attempted execution of the 68-degree starboard turn at Widener 11. At departure from the Colonel's Island terminal, the Golden Ray did not meet international stability standards and possessed less stability than the chief officer calculated. The chief officer made errors with the ballast tank level data entry into the shipboard stability calculation computer, LOADCOM, which led to his incorrect determination of the vessel's stability. The operator did not have a method in place to ensure that the chief officer was proficient in using the LOADCOM system to perform his duty of calculating the ship's stability. The operator's lack of oversight and procedures for auditing and verifying the accuracy of their officers' vessel stability calculations before departure contributed to the Golden Ray not meeting international stability standards. After the Golden Ray heeled, open watertight doors on Deck 5 allowed flooding into the vessel and blocked the primary egress from the engine room. The NTSB declared losses at estimated values of $62 million for the vessel and $142 million for the cargo. From the NTSB's recommendations, to G Marine Service Company, the company who employed the Golden Ray's crew, the vessel's operating company. Revise your safety management system to establish procedures for verifying stability calculations and implement audit procedures to ensure your vessels meet stability requirements before leaving port. Revise your safety management system audit process to verify crew adherence to the arrival-departure checklist regarding the closure of watertight doors. The multi-million-dollar salvage effort that followed, almost worthy of a video on its own, was a years-long saga that technically began about a month after the ship capsized. From Insurance Marine News, capsized car carrier Golden Ray has been deemed unsafe to right and refloat in a fully intact condition and has been declared a total loss. The Unified Command handling the salvage of the vessel said that plans were being developed to remove all of the Golden Ray's hull, components, and cargo by disassembling the vessel in place. Now, I say technically began in October of 2019 because that's when it became public regarding the decision to cut it up into sections rather than refloat. But the process itself took quite some time to plan and then get underway. The first cut wasn't made until late 2020. It was a grueling effort, battling fires, attempting to contain pollutants, and doing so while reportedly keeping the harbor open in the process. According to News 4 Jax, the final portion was removed toward the end of October in 2021. This event, from capsizing to beached monstrosity, the slow, agonizing, inglorious death and fate of the Golden Ray, a ship seen by many to begin with as an oversized appliance hauling oversized appliances. This was the prime example of a no-win scenario. It had already polluted so much, brought so much strife to these waters, that by the time salvage operations began over a year later, irreparable damage was done. The massive lawsuit filed in September of 2022 by numerous affected parties local to the Brunswick area would essentially summarize everything this calamity had allegedly become, as they sought civil penalties, injunctive relief, damages, attorney's fees, and litigation expenses against the following defendants: GLNV24 Shipping Incorporated, the vessel's owner; Hyundai Glovis Company, the charterer; G Marine Services Company, the vessel's operator; Norton Lilly International, the contractor who creates those preload plans, amongst 11 others. The lawsuits alleged over 6,000 tons of rock dropped into the Sound to stabilize the wreckage in an area known as Snag Alley. That a local salvage company initially hired to perform the removal, who disagreed with the eventual salvage method and wanted to take a more environmentally cautious approach, was overruled and replaced with a company the ship's owners preferred. That the defendants characterized the potential for spills to be minor and controllable, yet their Environmental Protection Barrier, or EPB, was alleged to not have been in place until June of 2020, which, according to these satellite photos here, do show it wasn't in place by at least January of 2020, with the EPB clearly visible in the next photo I pulled up, dated January of 21. That one of several spills throughout the aftermath prompted health officials in July of 2021 to issue warnings to swimmers and those fishing in the Sound and surrounding coastal areas. The suit cites repeated fires causing additional discharge of debris and hazardous fluids occurring throughout the wreck removal. also citing several substantial oil leaks making it past the barrier, allowing the oil to infiltrate the coastal wetlands, marshlands, estuaries, and beaches. Citing the salvage operations also caused numerous cars, car parts, and other debris to fall into the Sound, where many remain, while others were carried off in the currents. Alleging car parts and debris have and continue to wreak havoc on those who fish, boat, and rely on the local waterways to sustain tourism-based businesses. By 2023, according to the Brunswick News, the Southern District of Georgia's chief judge upheld 2 of the primary claims, totaling $98 million in damages. This is one major outcome from the trials I could find with a quick search, but again, even this article is as recent as September of 2023. This debacle has just dragged on and on. On a note of levity, though, it was refreshing to take on a project with no loss of life. These episodes take the amount of time they do because the fact-finding, the research, cross-checking, script writing are still performed exclusively by me, Sam. And you'll get no complaints from me, just some reasoning behind why I can't churn out the quantity over quality content, like so many others. 3D models, some explainer graphics, moderation, and a few other miscellaneous tasks are done with the help of some wonderful team members. But when it comes to the research, writing, and quality control, I'm extremely picky, almost to a fault. Add to that, I'm one of those Mr. Mom types, a dad with full custody, and frequently the kiddo's schedule, of course, gets priority. So, anyway, this channel continues to be possible due to so many Immortar supporters, and a special thanks goes out to those top-tier supporters on Patreon. Alex S., Andrew M., Andrew S., Broken Spectrum, Christian T., Emmanuel L., Joshua S., Kenneth P., Manuel M., Mark W., Melon Lord, Nathan M., Paul Rohrbaugh, P. Rush, Robert G., Rusty G., and Trayson. And don't forget, your safety matters.